Good morning, students. I'm sharing a lesson with you. It's going to help you with your reading of the text. There are two texts by Jamaica Kincaid. And the focus I'm giving you is not the only one. There are other areas for you to explore. But maybe I want to return to the whole topic of myths and myths associated with colonialism. So I got some information from Wikipedia, and it gives us some explanation of the wave of decolonization that swept the world that took place in the latter half of the 20th century. It is seen as one of the great liberating movements in history. Yet few seem to realize that colonialism is still with us. So maybe I'm giving you a little bit of the historic. And if we could trace things, instead of it being linear, it's more or less cyclical. What else did I find? As of 2012, 16 territories were deemed or are still deemed to be under colonial rule. The United Nations labels them as non-self-governing territories. The population, they have not been liberated. There was no independence. There are about 2 million people in these 16 countries, and they're spread across the globe. And they remained under the tutelage of the former colonial powers. And there's a nice name for them now, not colonial powers, but administering powers. But note, who are the administering powers? UK, that's England, USA, and France. So for all intents and purposes, they are still colonizers. Let's see. The next slide gives you dates, and maybe the diagram that I've placed here shows you the cyclical nature of things. And when you're looking at it, you could pause it. But whatever is self-explanatory, I'll just move swiftly. And so, maybe the former colonized, in the case of USA, becomes colonizer. And there is something, the 1898 Treaty of Paris, that ended a war and gave Cuba its independence. Also, the Philippines got their independence. Notably, Puerto Rico, Philippines, and the small island of Guam. The United States was suddenly a colonial power with overseas dependencies. And here you'll find it. This is the source of my information. What other territories do you know of? Consider the USA and its relationship with the US Virgin Islands, the Bahamas, among others. United States had almost all the attributes of a great power. It stood ahead, or nearly ahead, of almost all other countries. So this little bit tells you about the emergence of America as a superpower. And perhaps we have nicer terms in the era of globalization and what is the role USA plays. So a little bit of history and current affairs should help you along. Oh, the islands were purchased from the Danish by the United States in 1917 under the Treaty of the Danish West Indies. And I think this refers to the US Virgin Islands. So they bought it. The goal was to protect access to the Panama Canal in wartime. A little bit more history, and you'll understand the origins or the interests in the Panama Canal. But Derek Walcott, he gives us a beautiful poem that captures the whole nature of America's relationship with U.S. Virgin Islands. And the poem tells us, down the dead streets of sun-stoned Frederickstead. Notice the metaphor for the streets now that the Virgin Islands are owned by America. Dead streets, Sunstone, and this is probably the capital. You check it out for me. Frederickstead was the first free port. So here you could detect sarcasm. But by now you know what's a free port. They tell you it's duty free. You could come and shop. Check it out and see how true it is. But this is the first free port to die. To die. Notice how I'm reading. I'm giving you phrases as they are metaphoric. Dead streets to die. What they died for? Tourism. So what becomes the new catchphrase or the new reason for superpowers wanting to keep their hold on Caribbean and other territories? It becomes a very fantastic tourist destination. And maybe it is a little similar to what happens in Puerto Rico, except that Puerto Rico is, I'm not sure. Check out the relationship between USA and Puerto Rico and see what you get. But tourism is the thing that is made attractive. But from Walcott's point of view, it's about death, die for tourism. The metaphor tells you that tourism doesn't bring the kind of life and rejuvenation as some may want us to believe. And so, therefore, it is a whole myth associated with the tourist coming to the Caribbean. Jamaica Kincaid, in her essay or booklet, it's called A Small Place. She gives you a fantastic viewpoint. She does contrasting viewpoints. So, on one hand, you have the fantasy established by the tourists coming to, and in that case, it's Antigua. And that viewpoint is contrasted with the viewpoint of the person who lives there. So the first report to die, down the streets, the persona strolling, and here that again, funeral piece. Persona identifies himself as I. I'm reminded of life not lost to the American dream. So here is another aspect of the created myths that you should unpack. What does it mean when we talk about this American dream? And why are some of us so anxious to be a part of and experience the American dream? Now, here is the introduction of a contrast. But my small island simplicities pack better our new empires, civilized exchange. And don't miss it. Civilized is loaded with sarcasm. So you come to the Caribbean, and it is a new form of quote unquote civilization you're bringing. And notice how they're labeled. America is now our new empire. Civilized exchange of what? Cameras, watches, perfumes, brandy. All these things you get at a duty free place. And that's an example of the good life. So sarcasm again, tongue in cheek. And now, so cheaply on the price, check out what happens when two words of contrasting meaning come close to each other like love hate. So there is a literary device. It might be paradox. I'm not sure, but you check it out. All these things are equal to the good life. The good life is a part of the American dream. And so cheaply on the price, paradox, sarcasm. Not only the crime rate is on rise in the streets, lighted sun, stone arches, and plazas blown dry by the hysteria of rumor, a condominium drowned in vacancy. So it means that nobody's here. Its bargains are just set, but only a jewel house like drones over the bargain. And notice what happens with it. jeweled rooms. And we come to the end of the poem. The roulette, and there you have a symbol of spinning, changing. This spin oscillates away, figure of trade, that every morning will begin fresh by revving up green water round the pier head, heading for where banks of silver trick. Banks of silver, you may want to believe that they're talking about fishes, but it's all more or less monetary metaphors. Figure of trade, where the banks of silver trick. And money for whom? Development for whom? The good life for whom? So Walcott has a beautiful poem there that captures colonizer. Sorry, once colonized, America now becomes colonizer. And so you can look at how the myths associated with colonialism are exposed. Jamaica's Kincaid novel Lucy, she says, the persona says, Lucy, now that I saw these places, they looked ordinary, dirty, worn down. So many people entering and leaving them in real life. And it occurred to me that I could not be the only person in the world for whom they were a fixture of fantasy. So Lucy leaves Antigua to go live in America as an au pair. If you want to refresh your memory about the myths of empire, we had something early about Chinua Achebe. And here I place it again for you. We did it earlier, so I don't need to go through it again. And looking at fantasy versus reality, yes, you could look at Jamaica Kincaid's essay, A Small Place. Just to give you a little bit, examples of fantasy, the tourist sees the perpetual availability of sun, sand, sea, and sex. And one statement made, you move through customs swiftly, but it's ironic. And the reality is that Antiguans are living in a place that's suffering constantly from drought. Too poor to escape the reality. And I'm skipping again because time is going to be limited. And no, America is a former colony. The predicament of a young female migrant from the Caribbean post-colonial society. That's what we get in Lucy. Why leave your country? Analyze Lucy's quest. Look at the shattering of the fantasy that is sold as the American dream. The American dream is a national ethos, and that describes the American dream there for you. And that brings us to the end of the slide. And maybe I just want to share with you and many others who are in the class, if you've ever visited the US, the first reaction is one of shock because you thought it was all about the good living and people could pack barrels and send you a Nike shoe and you could get everything brand new from curtains, milk powder, whatever you want. And when you get there, you realize that people are struggling and they're just keeping up the fantasy for you in the Caribbean. So it's an interesting novel to read and study. It's a different take on the colonizer and the colonized. For example, Lucy becomes an au pair, and we get the distinct impression that she's living with a woman, taking care of children. There's a room that is placed there for her to use, and we do get the impression that she is treated more or less like a slave. So examine that and see what you get. Thank you.